because we're dealing with governance, we're dealing with governmental institutions and with political regimes, and so obviously these issues are handled very differently in different countries. So in this session, we are going to have Elizabeth Bomberg and Louis LaPierre, who are going to talk about the governance regimes. Elizabeth in Europe and Louis in Canada, focusing on the distinctive aspects of those regimes and giving us some perhaps perspective on what's happening in the U.S. from a comparative perspective. So Elizabeth is from the University of Edinburgh, and so she'll start. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Christine, and thank you, everyone. And I know you did not get to tank up on coffee, so I'll try to be as lively as possible. I'm really delighted to be here. I have learned already so much this morning, and I'm looking forward to exploring with you the experience of Europe, especially the European Union, and how they have thought to deal with, how they have approached this challenge of governance of shale. And you probably already noticed, and I hope you're not disappointed, but I am not Scottish, but I've been based there for some time, and I hope I can share some of that experience with you. So the first thing you might ask is, well, gosh, what the heck is she doing here? Why should we bother with Europe? Europe lags far behind in the development of shale. It's also different from the U.S. in some significant ways, not just culturally, but in terms of geology, in terms of regulation, in terms of the economic system. But what I hope to convince you of is that there are still lots of insights to be learned from thinking about the European experience, and not least because European policymakers face just the type of challenges that U.S. policymakers face as well in this area. Namely, how do you assess the risks associated with shale? How do you balance the risks and the benefits? How do you reassure the public? And how do you do all this in a very fragmented, multi-level system? So what I want to do is look at how Europe has approached this with the help and guidance of four principles. And again, I'm hoping that if we look at those principles, how and why they're applied, and the limitations of that application, that we'll be able to glean some insights. Okay, just a wee bit of background here. So the European Union, like the U.S., is characterized by significant internal variation. Variation in just not only variation in level of shale deposits, but lots of variation in the level of enthusiasm with which those shale deposits might be extracted. Okay? And the decision about extracting that, whether to frack or not to frack, is a decision that's left to individual member states. However, the European Union plays an incredibly important role here. The European Union has a legal, constitutional duty and right to ensure a secure supply of energy for Europe. It has the legal right to ensure the smooth functioning of energy and other markets. And equally as important, the EU decides binding legislation on several shale-related policies, not least in environmental policies, chemical and water quality, to be specific. So the EU, precisely because it has developed so slowly in this area of shale, has dedicated quite a bit of time and deliberation into discussions about shale and about the risks and how best to confront those risks. And this is an exciting time to study the EU in this area, precisely because it's developing, as we speak, we don't know if it's going to be binding or non-binding, but a regulatory framework to deal with shale on the European level. So let me explore with you the four principles that I think are most important in explaining the Europeans' approach to shale. Again, hopefully with the aim of seeing to what extent those can be applied or not here. The first principle is the precautionary principle. Many of you know about this already, but it's a guide for policymakers, and it certainly stipulates that in conditions of uncertainty, decision makers should act preventively, and they should act to prevent potentially serious environmental harm. Okay? Or to put it in a pithier way, uncertainty cannot be an excuse for regulatory inaction. Okay? And this principle is very firmly embedded in the EU's treaties and is reflected very much in many of the EU's laws and shale-related policies, specifically in water quality, and also in the suite of chemical legislation known as REACH. I want to talk about the rationale because I think this is where perhaps some of the insights will come. The rationale for applying this principle in the EU is twofold. One is as simply as a risk assessment tool. So the principle compels policymakers to gather data, to collect evidence, and to analyze potential risks based on that evidence. And that's particularly important in a relatively new area such as shale development. And this interpretation of the principle has been seized upon by opponents of shale, opponents of fracking, and has been used to say, if we follow this principle, it means not only should we have a moratorium, but we should not proceed because the perceived risks are too great. And you hear that over in opposition in other countries as well. What might be more interesting is the extent to which this same principle is used by proponents of shale development. And it's used not as a risk assessment tool, but as a reassurance tool. In other words, because we're applying this principle, we are proceeding with caution, and you, the public, or even opponents, you can be sure that we are seeking to put appropriate safeguards in place. Okay? And this is proved especially important in those reluctant states, and I think might be a very important insight for reluctant jurisdictions, reluctant states or localities here. Okay, each of these principles, for each of these, I want to also talk about what the limitations are, so that if policymakers and analysts choose to apply them, they will do those in full knowledge of what works and what doesn't. What are the limits of this principle? Well, of course, and these are well known, and business firms are the most vocal. They issue the most vocal reminders of the cost and time and money of applying this principle. It slows the process down considerably, and the testing and the experimentation can be quite costly. More interesting, and then drawing on the work of others, certainly Paul Sturm, but others here, is of course this notion that we can have a definitive conclusion about the nature of risk is misguided. That risks are about perception, that risks are socially constructed. So any scientific assessment is not going to be neutral, and might therefore result in quite inconsistent policies. Inconsistent policies can also lead to an inconsistent application of these policies, and this principle is implemented with more or less gusto across the EU, depending on several factors. But because it's inconsistently applied, you often find that firms and businesses face an unpredictability and an unlevel playing field, and this again further slows down the process. Finally, the precautionary principle, however strongly it's embedded in treaties and in the law, it's only as effective as it is implemented and monitored and enforced. And this issue comes up repeatedly in the EU, and it's already come up in discussions this morning in the U.S. realm as well. So my key summary insight regarding this precautionary principle is that we need to apply it with caution. It's very useful, I think, particularly as a reassurance tool, but it is contentious. It is consistently applied, and it's certainly not a panacea. Okay, the second principle I want to discuss is transparency. And again, this has come up, and I know we'll be talking about this more tomorrow, which is great. And again, the rationale or the idea of transparency is to ensure that the policies and practices and the policymaking procedures are open and accessible to the public. And in the area of shale, it refers to both process but also substance. So it's a huge element within certain legislation regarding, say, impact assessments, laws, but also, as we've already heard, disclosure, chemical disclosure. So these issues, how transparent should disclosure be, and who should enforce that? These are the issues that are currently being debated within the EU. But it also refers to not just the substance of policies, but how those policies are made, how those decisions are reached. And there's several mechanisms in place, not just in the EU, but perhaps more pronounced in the EU, to ensure that the policymaking process surrounding shale is as open as possible. And that includes a register of lobbyists, but it also includes a very popular complaint procedure. So transparency, I think, is very important in ensuring that the public can have a say and can have information known to them. And the rationale that its proponents often put forward is that it will provide not just better, but better supported policies. It's a trust-building mechanism. The idea being that more public scrutiny, more information will lead to a stronger accountability of both the industries and the policymakers. That means the public feels better about that, and you will have a better policy anyway. In the area of shale, fundamentally important precisely because in the EU polls, but also across other countries as well, the lack of transparency is seen as one of the major concerns voiced by citizens. And that was if any have had a look at the IEA's golden rules, that's one of their key themes. What are the limits of this principle? Well, again, as with a precautionary, you have an inconsistent application. Some are much more robust in how transparent they are, especially those Nordic countries. Compare that to a more centralized France or the UK, and that again leads to unpredictability and unlevel playing field for the firms. Something that's come up in a really interesting already in the discussion this morning, that it's not as though all information is a good thing. It doesn't necessarily mean that more transparency might not result in a better informed public. It depends on how that information is targeted. It depends on how that information is used. And something that hasn't been mentioned yet, but I think is really important, is that transparency might very well conflict with other aims and principles. And in the area of not just shale, but all policy making, all rulemaking often requires bargaining. It often requires that decisions are made which perhaps are best made not in the full glare of full transparency. This is an argument that one can debate. It's an argument made by member states, surely, and we can debate that. But certainly, what it raises, what I want to underline, is that the principles such as transparency might very well conflict with other aims of a polity or other aims of policymakers. So this principle, I would say, is double-edged. I think it is a very useful check, but it needs to be managed carefully. Consultation, again, I'm really looking forward to this session tomorrow. This refers to systematic interaction between policymakers and other agencies, but above all, interaction with stakeholders, with citizens, with NGOs, with firms, with experts. Okay? In the EU, this has been an absolutely key priority. Okay? How do we've seen what's happened elsewhere, how do we make sure that we're consulting those who will be implicated? And the EU has issued just a plethora of these, the elicitation process that we heard about this morning. There's been dozens of those. There's been focus groups, there's discussion papers, there's stakeholder events, etc. Okay, what is the rationale for this? One is that it's about information gathering. Whatever resource problems you've been discussing, the EU policymakers, those institutions are even more resource poor. So they need the information, they need the expertise that the NGOs and firms and experts can offer. But I think you might be more interested in the second rationale, which I'm calling stakeholder buy-in. So that is that consultation is not so much a way to collect information, it's a way to collect support. It's a way to win support from those who are most implicated. And the buzzword in the EU, and I've heard it this morning from Charles Davis, the buzzword here is inclusive governance. So that the consultation, crucially, is not just with those who come forth. The consultation explicitly includes those who are opposed to, in this case, shale extraction. The idea is to bring it all to the table, including the opponents, and have discussions early on, not about what to do about the problem, but about framing the problem. How is the problem perceived? And that is seen as a first step. And the other, not distinctive, but the other highlighted nature of consultation in the EU is that it also explicitly multi-level. So these are initiatives supported by the EU, but they actually implicate national and local and as well as the supranational level. And most attention right now has been on the local level, because this is seen as not just where opposition is most developed, but these are seen as the stakeholders who are most explicitly implicated. And I won't say much now because it will come up tomorrow, but there's a whole bunch of initiatives that are on the books there for participation and for buying in local citizens. I'll say more about that tomorrow, and so as not to get into it, but it's just a very, very busy area. Okay, what are the limits here on consultation and buy-in? For it to be effective, it needs to be widespread and balanced. And someone that I spoke to in the NGO sector said there's plenty of consultation between policymakers. The problem is the consultation is between policymakers and firms. Okay? And so it needs to be a much wider consultation. On the other hand, perceptions again matter here, because one person's kind of buy-in is another person just being bought off. In other words, that the results of the consultation, it needs to be, the policymakers need to convince those that they are consulting that what they've said in the consultation will be reflected in the outcome. And timing is important here, and that's why I have this cartoon here. That consultation needs to occur as the policies are being developed, not afterwards. The third limit is that often there's, and the EU is guilty of this, but maybe you can find examples too, a considerable amount of energy and money has been spent on consultation, when really even more resources are needed to implement what comes out of that consultation. So consultation and the resources for it need to be ongoing. So again, here what I would say is that even though it's tricky to get this one right, the idea of consultation, I'd argue that's quite critical for ensuring not just that the public is part of the process, but that the public perceives itself to be part of the process. My fourth principle, you're going to probably have to cut me off, you can be brutal. My fourth principle is one that I'm trying to sneak in because it doesn't come perhaps as automatically when you think of risk, but it's the principle of environmental sustainability. And here I don't just mean environmental risks. I mean the idea that all decision-making should consider environmental concerns, all decision-making around shale, and in particular, the idea that decision-making needs to keep in mind the sustainability goal of accelerating the transition to a low-carbon economy. This is the EU's main plank in environmental sustainability. And again, for the EU, this is undeniably more pronounced as a principle in EU discourse, in EU policy, than it is here, for a variety of reasons, including that, say, concerns over climate change tend to be greater there, concerns about fossil fuel lock-in. In other words, that the problem with shale, the main problem with shale is that it's taking away energy and resources from truly sustainable energy sources such as renewables, and all we're doing is locking ourselves into a fossil fuel economy. And the EU loves this because the EU has lots of problems, as you probably know, but one area where the EU can be strong is on environmental sustainability. So it has its own political reasons for pushing this, but I still think it's relevant for the US. One thing that I found, well, one thing I would argue that I argue in the paper is that the idea of sustainability, if you bring that into the discussion, that might be a more effective way of addressing some of the opposition that you find within in the U.S. in some states and some localities, especially in those states and localities that might comparatively put more emphasis on environmental awareness or have a strong renewable sector. And especially when, as we've heard this morning, when you're talking about shale development in densely populated or vulnerable areas, the idea of saying we're making these decisions not just based on specific risks, but we're bringing in the idea of sustainability when we make these decisions, that we're looking out for the long-term environmental sustainability of your community when reaching decisions about whether to issue a permit or what sort of regulation, if any, to implement. And it also adds this incentives that instead of just making a decision, do we frack or not, are there ways within fracking that we can bring in greener technologies or more sustainable methods? And all in all, I just think it provides more longer-term, more holistic assessment. So that's the pitch, the rationale. Okay, we've already heard it in one of the questions this morning, the web questions, didn't we, about sustainability as a rhetorical tool only. Can we really have sustainability, sustainable shale? Is that not an oxymoron? And this notion that sustainability is just a rhetorical fudge, this is also very much an issue within the EU. And the EU is far ahead in terms of sustainability rhetoric than it is in sustainability practice. So that's something to watch. It's also very interesting precisely because it's used by proponents and opponents. It's ambiguous enough to do that. So proponents use it. We've heard this from Zolberg this morning. Proponents would use it to make the argument that shale is a transition fuel, that it is more sustainable, that it provides a bridge we need from coal to that low carbon economy, whereas opponents to shale would simply say that if we care at all about sustainability, then we don't proceed with shale. Full stop. Okay. Some argue that some worry that a focus on sustainability will just give the opponents another stick with which to beat back this whole notion of shale development. Okay? But I think that's rather short-sighted. And I would say that although this principle needs to be modified in the U.S., you can't you can't invoke or just appeal to we need to restore the climate. It just doesn't have the same resonance here. So it has to be modified, has to be to pitch differently. But I think if you were to embed shale discussions in that broader sustainability principle or frame, that we could get a much more kind of holistic, longer-term assessment. Okay. This is my conclusion. I would, just trying to see how much time I have left. I have a short conclusion and then a longer one. I'll get the short one. You tell me if I need to stop. My short one is that I've just tried to introduce 4 principles, and you can think of others. I'm sure there are others. But also to note that that each has its real strength, but also limitations. So what we really need to guard against is any indiscriminate application of any of these principles. I've also tried to suggest or imply maybe that application to the U.S. Can be quite helpful if modified, or at least application to certain jurisdictions in the U.S. Do I have time for another? Okay, because I would also like to raise a couple themes that have come out of this, and maybe we can use these for discussion. And one is that these principles that I've introduced, they're not neutral, and that's what we as analysts want to look out for, that they are political, that they're invoked by different actors to serve particular interests. Okay? So this isn't a reason not to invoke them. It's not a reason to ignore them. It just means that we as analysts need to be mindful of who's invoking these principles and why, and what are the implications of that application. The second, since the workshop is about governance, and governance, of course, means different things to different people, but generally governance, if we think about it as an incorporation of norms and principles that can be used to guide a polity in a particular direction, well, principles, even when applied, that's all well and good, but it's only the first step, because governance implies that these principles are institutionalized. So they need to be implemented, they need to be monitored, they need to be widely accepted, they need to be coordinated across all these different interests. So application of the principles, adoption of the principles, I would say is sort of a first step. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition of governance. And this third point, my final point, and one perhaps you would expect me to say, wouldn't you? But I would put in the pitch for, why did they bring me all the way here? That I think precisely because of these challenges that have come up, that we do want to talk about best practice as a noun, not a verb. All right. We want to talk about best practice and what we can learn from different levels of governance, the national, the state, and the local. But also we perhaps want to gather as much information as possible from other polities, especially those that share some of these same fundamental challenges. Okay, thank you very much.
I think that was just what we needed, a lively, great presentation, right on time. And now our second speaker is LaPierre from Moncton University in New Brunswick, and he's going to talk about the Canadian regime and some of the special additions in terms of governance in Canada.
Thank you, and first of all, thank you for inviting me, and I hope I can share with you what we've been doing in New Brunswick. I just have to press here, I think.